Doing research is questioning and disagreeing. I'm Mayla Bogoslav and I study research. I ask questions such as, what is research? How do we measure its success? I live by the motto, ignorance is bliss, because when you don't know something, it's an opportunity to learn. Researchers live in the ignorance or the unknowns. They ask questions, identify areas of ignorance, lead the way to gain knowledge, and most importantly, ask the next questions about our new ignorances. Welcome to the Ignorance Podcast, where we learn about research through research questions. Let's welcome our guest researcher for today. Please introduce yourself by name only and your favorite thing to do outside of work.
My name is Kayla Haye, and my favorite thing outside of work is going to see live music in small venues with good friends.
Do you have a favorite venue or band or either?
I do. My favorite venue in Los Angeles is the Troubadour, which is this old small venue that has kind of an amazing history and a lot of photos of all the musicians that have played there over the years, and they kind of like book these up and coming bands in this fairly intimate space. It's really great.
How small is small?
Maybe there's like 200 or 300 people that pack in there, so you can always be pretty close to the stage and like really up close with the people performing.
What is it about going to these bands that kind of gets you out of your head, or why is it one of your favorite things to do?
Well, one, it totally gets me out of my head. I think when I'm listening to live music, especially in a intimate space like that, I just feel like completely absorbed with the experience and in the moment, and my brain is totally focused on it. And the other reason is my first career path was to be a musician, and my first degree at university was actually in jazz piano, and I thought I wanted to do music as a career for some time before I got into other things. So I really appreciate when someone's a great musician. It really puts me in awe, and I really appreciate their talent, and I feel a little bit envious at the same time about the job they get to do of just like giving people joy and being up on a stage performing.
Yeah, I feel that my connection with music is more dancing. And for sure, not that I thought I could be a dancer, but I saw that path in some ways for other people. And I also still get to dance on the side. So it's fun to still get to do some of these hobbies, even if it didn't end up being our bigger career at the end of the day. What questions excite you in your work? What questions are you currently pursuing in your day job?
So in my work, the things that really excite me right now and that I feel like a lot of my energy is directed towards in some way is how do we make major transformation and change to complex systems that impact our health and impact what we eat. And I find this question exciting and challenging because I think it's really hard to solve, that we tackle little bits and pieces of it. But um, a lot of what we study and a lot of the work we do in public health kind of creates little pieces of change in these complex systems, and we haven't quite understood or fully comprehended how to really make big and lasting transformations in complex systems in a way that like really pivots or transitions some of the trajectories that we're on.
Can I ask why this question?
For me, I think this has become an interesting question because I trained in psychology, and I've worked a lot in the field of public health, and I feel like in psychology we tackled some really interesting, important parts of this puzzle of like how to get people to change their behavior through their psychology and how they think and what they know and building new habits. But then my experience in the real world was that this is just really hard for people to actually implement, especially over a long period of time. And even when people are like really optimally like focused and they can be part of an intervention and they kind of do all the best gold standard things, which is hard for most people to even engage in the first place. Even then, often when they work with you for a few months and then they go back to their day-to-day lives and the effects of what you did just dissipate. I work mostly on helping folks eat healthier and be more active. And most of the families I've worked with, it's just they're so motivated and they so want to do this, but when they go back to their day-to-day lives, it's just so impossible to keep up. And so as I've transitioned through my career and worked in some different spaces around working with more families and not at the individual level and working with bigger community programs, I keep butting up to this challenge of we're making tweaks in little parts of this system in isolated spaces that create little actions of change, but the whole system is still just really encouraging people to not eat healthy and be sedentary and become really sick and have a lot of chronic disease and have really negative impacts on our environment. So I think the more I learn from trying to implement all these different practices, it's made me think a lot bigger picture in that we really have to think of some of these challenges like our food system and unhealthy diets, and that diet is the leading cause of death in our country and in our county. It has one of the biggest impacts on environmental degradation, that little band-aids and fixes, even if they're great gold standard approaches and really evidence-based, if they're just tweaking little pieces of this really huge system and puzzle, we're just kind of seeing the status quo and the system just play out over and over in the same way. I think the really interesting question and problem to tackle from a public health standpoint and a policy standpoint is what's actually required for a lot of changes to happen in a coordinated, systemic way that would transform our system so it's not behaving in the same way that makes people sick and degrades our environment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question of how people change. I don't think about it on that big macro level, but for sure in the team science world, a lot of it is also trying to suggest changes that people do. And especially when they're preventative changes, it's quite hard because we can't necessarily run the counterfactual and say, well, if you had done this, it would have been this way. So it's really hard to showcase the value. This leads to my next question of how do you hope to impact the world? If you could answer this question, what is that impact that you want to have on the world in general?
One of the impacts I'd like to have is helping people use tools from systems science and systems thinking and network science to better understand and conceptualize the complexity of a lot of the problems like the food system that we're trying to deal with. And I do think part of that is shifting away from too much reductionist thinking and focusing in on narrow problems and cause and effects and kind of isolating ourselves on specific pieces of the puzzle. Part of that is around the team science space. Like to be able to do this, we have to tackle these big problems across disciplines, but also across sectors often. Like science is going to be one piece of the information and insight that we need, but so is community perspectives and policymaker perspectives about what is actionable and feasible and fundable. I hope the bigger impact of my work is to do science that helps move those insights about what that looks like forward, but also that I'm working actively on projects with all of these partners and collaborators across disciplines and across sectors, that we are putting this into practice and seeing how it works. And we're all learning from each other to adopt these strategies for how we tackle complex problems like poor diets and poor food systems.
It's an interesting impact, this idea of helping people work together or understand change or figure out the policies that they would need to enact to be able to create change. So maybe it's a level higher than just the people on the ground, but really the system level at the biggest level. Do you have an example of something you've done in that realm?
Yeah, maybe a good concrete example is thinking about trying to get people to eat healthier. Right now, about 90% of Americans don't eat what's defined as a healthy diet, and their diet scores on a scale of 0 to 100, where 1 is like perfectly aligned with the healthy dietary guidelines. Most people are around a 40%. So when we work with different community groups or government folks around how do we help people eat healthier, often an assumption is we need to like tell them tell them to eat healthier and give them information, and that assumptions really rests on this mental model that eating is this sort of rational decision making process where if we just give people the right pros and cons, they will make some rational decisions about eating healthier. And psychology actually really shows that is not a good model for eating behavior because it's such a highly automated habitual behavior that often operates fairly unconsciously, is really shaped by cues internally and externally, and is habitual in a way that's massively self-reinforcing through those routines and cues. And so that's one insight that psychology brings to the table that kind of suggests actually what we need to do is help people disrupt their routines or create new routines, not give them information. And then when we partner with folks in data science and geography and public policy, we also get insights about like what are some of the best evidence and new scientific perspectives around shifting policy that might incentivize healthy food options. Some of that work has shown that um, restriction and labeling has some effect, but incentives are really powerful. So there's been a shift in local programs around food stamps that are referred to as the supplemental nutrition program now in the United States. Like California's really adopted some of these incentive strategies to double your bucks if you purchase fruits and vegetables as opposed to more restrictive ones. We have some evidence is more appealing and more effective for shifting behavior. And partnering with folks in geography and data science, I know we've had long assumptions that the food environment in your neighborhood, and if you live in a food desert, is really constraining. But some of that new work is showing using big data and mobility data to say, actually, people are spending most of their time eating in other spaces, and those spaces actually have a bigger influence in shaping food choices than the ones around your neighborhood. I think that's one example where trying to see that bigger picture and how these things work together and bringing together some of the best insights from these different disciplines and different sectors gives us much more holistic, bigger picture strategies of how to make changes in this space. So we move away from let's put a public campaign out to tell people if they don't eat healthy, they're going to get sick, to strategies that involve like routine shifting and targeting, trying to identify hotspots of where people are eating and incentivizing healthy food purchasing in those spaces, which just looks really different to the strategies we would have come up with without thinking about that big system.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about where do I normally eat? Is it my neighborhood or is it somewhere else? And I'd probably argue that in my neighborhood, I'm usually making my own food. But when I'm not, that's when I'm necessarily going out. So it's like really interesting to think about because I never would have made that connection in my head that like all my food spaces are actually not in my area. A lot of them are somewhere else. So you just told me how you want to influence the world in some of these specific ways and larger ways. Who has influenced you and who are people you look up to?
I think I had some really early exposure. When I was doing my PhD, I was in Australia at the University of Adelaide. I, first of all, had like absolutely no intentions of doing a PhD or getting into research. I had started in a jazz piano program and was dabbling in psychology courses because I thought maybe I would do some music therapy as well. But I ended up with this great mentor who was one of my psychology professors, and she encouraged me to do a master's degree. And then at some point was like, well, have you ever thought about a PhD? And I was like, no, definitely not. And she's like, well, this is what it looks like. She was a really early influence because one, she just got me excited and interested in research. She was affiliated with the university, but her main position was in a government research organization on nutritional sciences that was the main government body where there was nutritionists, policymakers, psychologists, geneticists, all working together on the dietary guidelines for Australians, for major public policy around nutrition. So when I got funded to do my PhD through the Australian government, I was actually at that organization. I wasn't at the university. So my really early exposure through her was working on these teams to solve pretty applied problems in the nutrition space with a whole bunch of different disciplines and sectors involved. The work we did through our PhD ended up in some of the biggest selling books around diet in Australia and like really shaping a lot of Australian diet guidelines that year. And that was just such a, I don't know, exciting space to work. And she was a really influential role model for me about how she did really rigorous science. She was a really great psychologist and behavioral scientist, but a great model of like how to do that in some spaces where you can really translate the work that you're doing and have an impact. I think her and a few other folks like that I've met along my career, where I've seen them recognize that, there's important things in academia, advancing knowledge and addressing new research questions. But a few people who've been able to balance that and balance the practicalities of getting promoted and moving your career ahead and generating good science with also building bridges to other disciplines and other sectors where they have put energy and become really effective at hearing what's going on in the bigger world and what problems need to be solved, and then having relationships with those people to help do that. It has been really influential in me, I think, especially in medical and public health spaces where we're really aware that there's a lot of resource constraints. There's a lot of problems to work on. There's a limited amount of research dollars. There's a limited amount of energy that policymakers can spend. There's a really limited amount of resources and time that community organizations and people on the ground actually implementing stuff have. So I think those people have also helped me think about being very intentional about what are the really tractable, important problems to work on that can have some impact sooner than later.
So this really big focus on impact at large, and actually not just asking a question, just to ask a question, but to ask a question that can really be applied. And when you find some answers or maybe even new questions, it can go out into the world and make a difference.
I do think that's important. I recognize that there's a real value in basic science not always being problem focused and generative of new ideas. But I think in the space I've worked in public health, the amount of problems to tackle and the limited amount of resources, I think really makes the argument for trying to be strategic about what we're spending often taxpayer dollars on working on in science, and how we make sure that that is benefiting people in some way.
That in general is partially why I chose the job I have, actually working with you, which is really fun, where I really didn't just want to be doing research. And so I really love that I don't just get to study teams, but I actually get to work with teams and impact them in some way. I appreciate that that's your lens as well, and have enjoyed working with you from that perspective. With that, how do you know if you've been successful at your work and as a researcher? What is your evaluation criteria?
I feel like as researchers, we have a lot of metrics of success, and we have to find the ones that are also important to us. And for me personally, if the work that we're doing is helping have an impact on people's lives, that is a big metric of success. One example of this, our team had been working on some complex data and modeling of the food system in Los Angeles and generating valuable new kind of scientific approaches to study how people intersect with their food environment. We'd been doing a lot of surveys just to monitor diet and food and nutrition security. And one of the things that wasn't like scientifically innovative necessarily, but that had the biggest impact was that we made an effort just to collect some really granular, timely data about food insecurity in LA County using some really rigorous population types of surveys and just generating statistics every 6 months about how many folks were food insecure. And that by far and away has had the most impact of all the work we've done in the last 4 years, because local government and local community organizations and food banks just didn't have that data to make the argument that actually the rate of food insecurity in LA is like 10 percentage points higher than it is of the national rate. The number of times folks have come up to me, like leaders in the food space or community food organizations, and said, thank you so much for that data, that one percentage, because I was able to use that to go to funders, to go to policymakers, to make the case. Then we got money and resources and we scaled up our initiatives. That was one example where it was sort of a simple 2-page report, and Not the most earth-shattering science, but it was really impactful work. So that sort of stuff is really important metrics for me. I also think we work in academia. We get the privilege and opportunity to advance science and knowledge. And I do think that is a really important area of my work as well for me personally. The metrics of success in that are some of our standard like academic metrics, like are you doing rigorous, innovative science that is getting funded by research grants and published and used by your peers. And, that's a complex process and one with many challenges and biases, but being out there and marketing your work and doing good science and working with great people and being really rigorous and as innovative, I also think is a marker of success for me. Although I will caveat that some of my more innovative, rigorous work is not always the stuff that gets cited and picked up. And I think that's true for a lot of scientists, where getting new ideas to diffuse and spread and adopt isn't an easy process too. So our social networks as scientists and getting our ideas out, I think, is part of that process. The last thing that feels like a real marker of success for me is if the people I'm working with feel fulfilled, they feel like they're doing work that they want to do, things that they find important, valuable, and rigorous. I think if I was hitting the other two, having an impact and publishing great papers, but I was sort of miserable at work and the people around me were not energized by the work we were doing, I would feel like one of the legs of the stool was really off.
So I heard three, this idea of real world impact, the classic academic metrics of publishing and grant funding, and then also this idea of actually enjoying the work that you do and having the people around you enjoy the work.
I don't know if I'd use the word enjoyment. I think energized. I think academia is hard. Research is hard. It's a hustle. There's things that go wrong all the time. Sometimes it's really fun and exciting, but sometimes it is not. So I think for me, being in teams and doing work and working with people in a way that is energizing, even when things are, all going wrong and feel really difficult, that to me, I think that's the bigger marker of things are working.
Yeah, energy. I think there are definitely moments where I feel super energized and moments where I feel very drained in doing the work where there's a lot going on. But this point in general, that when you're doing research, you really don't know where it's going to lead you. And so things shift. I think that's part of the hard part, that there's definitely an unknown and uncertainty. And sometimes you haven't found something for a while, and then all of a sudden you find something, and that's why it picks up. I think those ups and downs also are really valuable in research too. Thinking back to grad school, I definitely had some highs where, things were just not working for whatever reason. And then finally, when you get it, it's like you're high on the world. It's such an amazing feeling at large. So thinking about results, what has been your most surprising result?
My most surprising result is how hard it is to change behavior. I know I started with this as the assumption I work from, but it always surprises me just how hard it is. Helping people eat differently or lose weight or change their lifestyle in a way that's going to manage or prevent disease is so hard. There's just so many forces that prevent us from doing this. And I've definitely had the experience where I'm like, oh, okay, I feel like we've really got the best program design. The last 10 years, I've worked with a colleague at Cedars on a program building healthy habits for families that have some high risk factors like poverty or other challenges they're facing. And we work with them in the first 2 years of their children's life through home visiting programs. We'd spent so much time and really brought in the best psychology and best, evidence-based strategies to have these really simple, adoptable programs for healthy eating and making sure we're surrounding families with the best support through their home visitor and getting them onto assistance programs. I'm like, this is really going to work and really going to help families. We're finally going to get somewhere in making some change. And things were going really well. Our pilot studies were going really well. And then COVID hit and the rug got pulled out from under all of these families, and they all became food insecure. They all were struggling to eat healthy because they were just trying to get shelf stable food that would last for a while and not be out in the supermarket to protect them and their kids from COVID. And it just was one more reminder that we can make something that's really great and really help people change their behavior, but then something happens in the system that is one more big roadblock to behavior change. And yeah, that still surprises me just how hard it is to achieve this and like how complex it is, and how kind of big we have to go to enable actual behavior change for people. There just has to be so many pieces of the puzzle working together.
Have you done some work during COVID about food insecurity? And the statistics you were talking about earlier are really fascinating to think about. Just one number can really change the game for a lot of people, even if it's not you're the one advocating, it's you putting that data out there that then they can really advocate for themselves. I'm curious, what is the solution? COVID definitely changed a lot of things. Was there some solution that you guys came up with afterward that could have helped those families when something like COVID hit, now that it's been a number of years since that situation?
So as that work was happening and as rates of food insecurity spiked to like a third of LA County becoming food insecure that first year of the pandemic, which is insane in a wealthy country and county like this. By food insecure, I mean families reporting that they're skipping meals or not eating for a day and they're hungry and they're struggling to get enough food. The county government and some community organizations formed a roundtable on food equity at that point, around that food crisis. And we did work with them a lot on building data ecosystems and mapping and understanding the complexity of the food system in LA County and all of the things that matter and shape what people eat. As we generated this systems map with these stakeholders, it was things like household poverty through to historic neighborhood redlining that has kept affordable, low-cost supermarkets out of a lot of neighborhoods, and the cycle that people can get into around poverty, not eating well, being food insecure, getting sick, having medical bills, not being able to work well, and then that cycle like perpetuates. So we did a lot of work with them around mapping the complexity of that system, and the county and folks leading this in Los Angeles were also really interested in this larger systems transformation. And so we worked for a year and a half with them on a strategic plan for the next 10 years around transforming the food system and having a more smart and connected food system and leveraging data and science as part of that, amongst other things that they wanted to prioritize. And that plan is now being implemented with a new Office of Food Systems. So there's a lot of positive movement and money investment, like 20 million went into a bunch of different grants to a whole bunch of organizations working across all these aspects of the food system, sort of with the idea that trying to create some real transformation by seeding change across many parts of things, from urban farming through to better food assistance, through to better nutrition education and school meals. But the story is still hard because even with this momentum and investment and big picture vision for the county, what's happening right now is a lot of the federal programs are getting cut, and things that were changing or supporting key parts of that system have been shut down. So for example, a key piece of this puzzle that we'd been talking about with them is trying to help kids early on eat healthy food, because it's so critical to preventing disease, establishing healthy food preferences and habits that you have for your whole life, and getting kids healthier meals at home and in school is a key piece of that. There had been a really good program getting local farm produce with a short supply chain from local farmers to keep the economy here supported and the farmers here supported into schools. And that was $1 billion federal program. And the head of LAUSD's nutrition program said, yeah, this really was helping us get lower cost, healthier foods into the schools. And that program just got completely eliminated in the last 6 months. So I think the long story short is that there's exciting momentum and things happening that was stimulated by this, and some really exciting systems level coalitions and change happening that's building on some really great momentum and work that has been happening in LA for a while, and local investment. But at the same time, there's some big macro changes that are putting wrenches in parts of the system that we thought would be able to move forward.
It's interesting how much the food we eat is not a priority for a lot of people.
When I talk to my class about this, when we think about what's the goal of the food system, the people who own it and oversee it, their goal is to produce as much food as possible for the maximum profit. That's the incentive currently. And so we spent some time thinking about, what if we upheld the agreement that healthy food's a human right, and the food system was managed by a group of people that decided that its goal would be to feed people nutritiously and prevent disease and minimize the impacts on the planet and ensure that the profit and benefits of that food system were distributed equitably. It would look immensely different to the food system we have now that is not set up to focus on those goals. Rates of food insecurity right now nationally is 13% in the United States. That is the highest it's been since immediately after the 2008 recession. After that recession, we sort of gone down to 10% nationally. And it's just ticked up in the last couple of years with rising food prices and inflation and other factors that are making it harder for folks to get food. In LA County, we are a lot more vulnerable to food insecurity, partly because of the composition of people that live here. There's just higher percentages of people that live closer to the poverty line because cost of living is so high here. And we also have a lot of race and ethnic diversity and groups that are historically at higher risk for food insecurity because of structural factors that have prevented them from having wealth or having neighborhood resources. So in LA County, the rate of food insecurity actually went up to 1 in 3 households at the peak of the pandemic. And we're currently at 25%, so much higher than the 13% nationally. So this is a problem, that we need to really understand the local story on, because we have a lot more volatility and vulnerability here with people struggling with hunger and having enough food to eat.
Sad. And can you say what class you teach?
Yeah, I've taught through my career mostly in public health and theories of health behavior change, and in a master's of public health program or health behavior PhD programs. But the last few years, I got the opportunity to create my own class. And so I created a class called Food Health in Place that is really about using system science and drawing on multidisciplinary perspectives to understand our food system and how it shapes what we eat, how it shapes the health of the public, how it has an impact on our environment and carbon emissions and water usage, and how it impacts things like equity in terms of equity in health outcomes, but also equity in who's getting money and benefiting from the food system and who has power over it. And we focus in that class on tools to understand these things, drawing on perspectives from psychology and sociology and geography. But we also have a real focus in the class around what does it look like to transform a complex system like this. So these tools are really helpful for understanding it, but how do we use those to think about transformation and the ideas and people and coalitions that would be involved in that?
Sounds like an amazing class that maybe general people should understand too, of like how does our food affect all this? Because I don't know that I've thought about it that deeply personally, but in this conversation, it's definitely changing my thoughts on how I think about food at large.
Yeah, that class has been so fun because I'm teaching it as a general elective. And so I have 50 students in the class, and they're from their first through their final years of undergraduate. They are in drama and business admin, and some are athletes, and some are in health sciences. It's been really interesting. Everyone eats and everyone has an interest in food. And part of the class that we talk about with transformation is everyone has 3 votes a day on the food system with your fork. As consumers of food, we are some of the most powerful people in the system, in how we shape it and how we demand what we want from the people selling us food. No matter what discipline or space you work in, you're going to intersect with the food system, and you have a pretty powerful role in it.
It'd be interesting to track how students have changed over time in their food consumption just by your class. And then I also have a friend who's a vegan and he doesn't want to necessarily impact it in any way. He wants every living thing to live its best life. And so he really wants to be able to photosynthesize is his goal and not have to interact with the food system. So I don't think we're there yet, but just kind of an interesting idea. But yeah, another question I love to ask is, what is your favorite disagreement?
Right now, I really like debates that are happening in public health and in psychology and public policy around changing what groups or populations are doing. Behavioral economists, I think, are talking about this a bit as individual or structural framing. And it's sort of this argument between what's more effective and impactful. Is it focusing on individuals, getting them to change what they're doing through what they know and their psychology and things like behavioral economics and nudges, or really thinking about structural level shifts, which are policies and programs that essentially change the choice set or incentives around people. And the arguments around this that are interesting is around what has a bigger impact. Structural things can sometimes be much less resource intensive, like change the policy, put a different default setting, architect the environment so that the healthy choice is the easy choice, versus really time and resource intensive programs and things to work with individuals and try to push them in a direction that might be not what their environment is supporting. And the things that I find interesting about this are, one, we often get into this dichotomy of which is better. For me personally, if we think of it from a complex systems perspective, it's not either or, it's the combination that's interesting. Like, where do we see the most synergies? I think it's also interesting when you think about it in terms of personal choice and agency. And there's some really interesting arguments around how do you set up a choice set or architect an environment that isn't paternalistic, that still leaves people with independent free choice. Like, if they want to go eat a burger, they can go eat a burger, but that it architects the environment in a way where that choice isn't the default, constant, easiest, cheapest, most accessible choice all the time, all the time, all the time. I think one of the talks I heard that struck me a lot, or that I remember really clearly from when I was a graduate student, actually, was someone at a conference talking about how high the rates of diabetes are right now in the US, and projections of half our population is going to have diabetes by, midway through the century, and that this is massively expensive and massively difficult to manage for people. And like, why is this happening? He sort of concluded his talk with, if 50 years ago we had set out to design a country and cities that would just maximize the number of people that had diabetes because they would drink so much added sugar, they would move and behave in ways that would just optimize their chance of getting diabetes, we would have designed our country in the way that it is now. That has stuck with me so much because I think a lot about how these individual and structural frames are working together and how we do this, especially in a place like the US where individual choice and agency over anything, but also over what we eat, is really important to people. So ethically and from a community standpoint, but also intellectually, I find that disagreement about which is better or where should we be investing our time, what has the biggest effect size, a pretty interesting conversation.
I'm curious then your thoughts on Ozempic as an example. Is that an us and I frame both maybe?
I feel like Ozempic's like a classic individual band-aid for a big societal problem and like a food systems problem. With one brand name of a GLP drug that works really well at a hormonal level to make you feel full. It should not be dismissed that, like, this is a very effective drug. People have massive positive changes to their health and their well-being when they take this, and that should not be dismissed at all. And I think we're also classically delivering this in a way where it's like, here's your Band-Aid. See you later. Let's not change anything else because this one silver bullet thing is working for people right now. To me, what's interesting is, what if we also really transform the system at this time where people are ready to change what they eat and having these personal shifts that are really positive and healthy for them. We still have concerns that just like bariatric surgery, where if people take these medications for a couple of years, they see a lot of positive changes. They're very expensive. Most insurers and people won't be able to take them for like a really long term. People go back into their environments and back to their lifestyles. And if those are the same as they were before, we are seeing weight gain for people afterwards. So I think we're kind of in that same circle of like, oh, here's a silver bullet. We don't need to pay attention to anything else. And we're missing an opportunity to leverage that change to help tap into a systems level transformation. But there's also really interesting side effects with that. The most interesting ones I was reading about was the stock prices of big corporate food companies really dropping when Ozempic results started coming out because they're making so much profit of selling junk food, and they're estimating they're going to lose big percentages of the amount of food they can sell because people are just eating less with these medications. So they're starting to reformulate and actually make smaller portion sizes and sizes that are accommodating for these meds, which is a positive, maybe unexpected piece of the response from the food system. But, they're also putting protein into candy bars, a lot of complexity.
So, last question before I ask you to introduce yourself. If you could do anything not limited by grants or other factors in your space, what would you be doing? What is your vision for the world?
I've really tried to align all my work around food and food systems the last few years. And so if I could be mayor of the world for a day or a year, let's say, we have documents that agree that healthy food is a human right, but we don't uphold that promise. And so I would implement that we are abiding by the belief that healthy food is a human right for people. I would restructure the food environment so that it's overseen and coordinated more by international and government bodies, that it serves these goals of getting people nutritious food and trying to keep our planet healthy and making sure that the power and benefits of the system are distributed more equitably, not to maximize production and profit. I just think the impacts of that would just be momentous on people's health and on the environment. A quarter of greenhouse gas emissions come from our food system. So yeah, if we all put our energy into that for a year, there would be some really amazing benefits globally.
Yeah, I hope that vision can come true at some point. I'm a pescatarian. You're a pescatarian also. So also this idea of eating what we preach too.
So there's some formal like planetary health diets and sustainable diets out there. The ones that I share with my class, they do allow for small amounts of animal-based protein, but the portions are like a tenth or even less of what a standard American diet would be. There's a lot of modeling and work done that people, if they want to eat some animal protein, could do so in a way that's really sustainable, but we just have to really shift the quantities and the sourcing. So an image I always share with my class is one beef burrito has as much impact on the environment as 9 veggie burritos. And it's like driving your car hundreds of miles with a gas car. So thinking about like sourcing your animal protein from sources like fish or even poultry, which are much more environmentally sustainable. And if you can choose options that are ethical and farmed in a way that align with your beliefs, like even better. But we need a food system that actually makes that sort of stuff financially accessible to more people, because currently it really isn't.
So yeah, I'll ask you to introduce yourself. Please state your name again, your job title, and your field, and anything else you'd like to share.
So my name is Kayla Haye. My job title is Associate Professor of Psychology and Spatial Sciences at USC. I direct Food Systems Institute at USC and also work with you as co-director in research development for our SCCTSI. And I am transitioning in a couple months to be a professor of community health sciences at UCLA. So that will be my title in a couple months too. And yeah, my field, I guess I am trained as a behavioral scientist in psychology. But I very much identify with my field being public health and the application of behavioral and systems science to public health and community nutrition.
My biggest takeaway is that little things can make a big difference. We don't know the impact our research will have, but Kayla showed us that just putting it out there to the public can have huge impacts. The statistics her team publicized on how many folks were food insecure in LA every 6 months allowed many more people to gain access to food. Let's keep putting research out there because you never know what can happen. What do you want to put out into the world? This podcast is hosted by me, Mayla Boguslav, and produced and edited by Joshua Mendel. To learn more about this episode's guest and any cited or named people, take a look at the episode description. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ignorance Podcast. Please follow the Ignorance Podcast wherever you get your podcasts to learn about science through research questions.